All right, welcome friends and comrades to our first session of our study group on Domenico Losurdo's Western Marxism. Very happy to welcome everyone here. I'm Daniel Tutt. I'll be hosting this study group. Again, our format is just sort of open discussion forum. We want to keep it lively. We want to have comradely debates. I think folks that are with us have strong views on Losurdo uh, across the entire spectrum of views that are possible to have on Losurdo. And that's actually, I think, a good blessing of this group. Um, Part of my objective in this reading group is to get a better conception of what Western Marxism is. Tonight, I'd like to say a few things about Losurdo's general orientation to Western Marxism, as Gabriel Rockhill and Jennifer Ponce de Leon's introduction states it, and I've read about half of the book. I'm going to be rereading it with you all. But I've also recently read Perry Anderson's Considerations on Western Marxism, published, I believe, in 1976, if I'm not mistaken, and Russell Jacoby's Dialectic of Defeat. I just recently finished that. And so I have a few things to say about those interventions in relationship to Losurdo's. And so I'd like for folks to weigh in on that. Tonight's just a sort of the big picture. Um, First, we should say something about who Losurdo is as a philosopher, as a historian, as a communist. I can say a few general things, but then I do want to invite folks that have done work on Losurdo and have read Losurdo's work to also jump in. So he is an Italian communist, which you saw in Rockhill's very nice introduction. Was born into the kind of cauldron of the rise of fascism in Europe, and became a highly prolific author. His wife was a German specialist. He's trained uh, in sort of like a comparative history approach, which is described by a thinker that I respect a great deal by the name of Jan Riemann, who was responsible for translating Losurdo's book into German on Nietzsche, the aristocratic rebel. Jan Riemann says that Losurdo develops a comparative historical methodology which seeks to situate what I call in my review of his book on Nietzsche, a kind of wide context approach to a given thinker. And you could almost consider Losurdo's interventions in two broad buckets. The first bucket is this critical intellectual biography and balance sheet, for which he's written on Kant, not translated. His book on Kant could be, the title of which could be translated to Self-Compromise and Censorship in Kant's Political Thought, which is an incredible book regarding the origin of Kant's ethics in response to the Jacobins, in response to the left flank of the French Revolution, and how the philosophical establishment neutered Kant's radicalism, in short. That is not yet translated. He's also done a comparative study on Gramsci, not translated. Hegel, that is translated. Nietzsche, the aristocratic rebel, was translated into English in 2020. The Nietzsche book is important. When it was released in Italy, it served as what you might call a tonic or a point of contrast within the communist left against Deleuze's famous book called Nietzsche and Philosophy. And in Italy and in France, before even in the United States or in the Anglo sphere, we're just exposing to it in 2020. For example, in France, my comrades there with Michel Clouscard's circle have informed me that it had serious reverberations in the French left. It changed the fundamental picture and the image of Nietzsche for the left. And I think it's possible that since 2020, in these last 4 years, it's already done that here. We can debate that. We can discuss that. Aristocratic Rebel is the text that is seen, I think, as Losurdo's most systematic in the field of intellectual comparative historiography. Um, Now, what I don't know about Losurdo, which I invite other specialists who may be on this call to elucidate, I don't know much about Losurdo's training. I don't know much about the methodology from which his formation as a historian comes about. And I'd be very curious for, I think that we do have a couple folks that do more work in Losurdo than I have. That might be interesting to elaborate for us. But then the other type of work that Losurdo does, he's also written a book on Heidegger, by the way, which is on the ideology of war, an incredible work on Heidegger that I benefited from immensely. Um, but then another bucket of texts and interventions that Losurdo has put forward are kind of topical, right? So these are what you might call revisitations of the meaning of communism in the wake of the collapse of really existing socialism, right? So in this sense, he's revisited the meaning of violence and nonviolence, an incredible book on nonviolence, where he's looking at Martin Luther King Jr., he's looking at Gandhi, he's looking at Hannah Arendt, and he's sort of bringing that same comparative methodology, but doing so in such a way where he's contextualizing them in the context of a class struggle, understood through a Marxist lens of class struggle. He does the same thing in another text called, I forget the exact title, but it's on the concept of class struggle. And it's in that text that I would recommend you use as a reference point for some of Losurdo's definitions of things such as populism. So in the text we're going to read together, he will lump Hartenegri, even Badiou and Zizek and Agamben as in practice, as effectively positing a conception of populism, precisely because he thinks that populism is a form of class analysis, which insists upon a sort of a development of a non-Marxist theory of the class struggle that seeks to identify sort of a third option beyond the primary schism of bourgeoisie and proletariat. So that's an important caveat. And I would actually say that his book on class struggle is an excellent, almost encyclopedia for a lot of concepts in Losurdo that are original. I would recommend, I benefited a lot from that. For example, here's a good example. He analyzes Hannah Arendt's work through her relationship and almost like editorializing of the American civil rights movement in the context of her development of her own theories of revolution, showing how their basis of her theories of revolution are already compromised into this sort of highly liberalized, extraordinarily racist. And he brings the receipts to show the degree of Hannah Arendt's racism that almost baffled me. I mean, baffled me precisely because she's invoked so much by liberal academics. Anyways, go ahead, Aaliyah.
Yeah, just before we move on too much from his kind of publication history, I have just kind of like a just a comment, but then a question. I want to, in the intro, it points out that on top of this, theoretical work and the critical work and, this philosophical study that he's doing, he was also, doing this kind of journalistic and editorial work, writing these weekly commentaries for uh the his party's newspaper in the 70s. And so, just want to honor like the communist commitment to the newspaper form. And I think that like it's I don't know, easy to get stuck in our books and not always necessarily spend the time reading these kind of like short form, quicker commentaries that are responding to events as they happen. But it's such an important part of just Marxist history in general. There's
Yeah.
a reason why our leaders always worked on papers. But I guess then just as a quick question, do you know if that stuff is like collected anywhere where it's like actually like viewable? I understand it probably wouldn't be translated, but I mean, is it like available to us to read?
His journalism,
Hmm.
I'm not sure. That's actually a good question. I think I know a friend who is a specialist in Italian communism that I will ask. So
I
would you?
looked a little for it online. I didn't have a
Yeah,
lot of luck, but
yeah,
just putting that out there. Thanks.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean that's actually a good point because I think it behooves us to recognize that a lot of Losurdo's intellectual interventions, take the book on Nietzsche. Why did he write that book on Nietzsche? It was because the 1976 uprising in Italy had centered Nietzsche as the primary philosopher of the radical left, of the communist left, and Montanari and Colli, two Italian translators, were the ones responsible for bringing to life 10,000 unpublished pages and fragments of Nietzsche. And their influence on the Communist Party in Italy was immense, was tremendous. So Losurdo himself went into those fragments of Nietzsche that were unpublished to provide a different interpretation. Yeah. So he's always responding in that sense. And the same with his book on Gramsci, which I have some familiarity with. It has a similar impetus. He's always responding, I think, to a very specific conjuncture, right? I think that's a very interesting innovation of his. He calls himself a realist in distinction to a utopian socialist. So, in that sense, he has a certain general fidelity, you could say, to Engels' scientific socialism. But the difference, I think, is that Losurdo does not have a philosophical or sort of highfalutin conception of philosophy that a lot of like Second International post-Engelsian Marxists would have. That's not to say that Losurdo is anti-philosophical. Again, here I would recommend his text on Hegel and the freedom of moderns to get a very clear sense of Losurdo's uh, Hegel, right? It's a very distinctive Hegel, and it must be said in some sense very much in line with Lukács's approach to Hegel from the young Hegel, right? Which was always an effort to situate Hegel as an imminent political economist himself prior to Marx, right? Well, sort of very much has that almost what you might call imminent Marxist progressive reading of Hegel, which looks very different, I think, than the Žižekian version of Hegel that so much of us in the West are familiar with. Go ahead, Colin, please.
Hey, everyone. Um, so sorry for a spoiler, because I finished the book already. But there's a passage when he talks about, how it can be Western Marxism can be reborn, where he talks about the line where Hegel says that philosophy is one's own time comprehended in thought. And what he notes is he says that there's a biographer of Hegel who says that Hegel's desk was covered with newspapers, and he was always like collecting newspapers and reading newspapers. And sort of takes this to be like a key thing that he finds both in Hegel and Marx that he then says was perhaps missing in a lot of these Western Marxists. That perhaps what these people who missed the historical events that were going on in their time or had bad takes on it, perhaps he says like, what did their desks look like? Did they have newspapers on it? Were they not in touch with their times enough to um to respond to it? And so I think that that's a very interesting point. And it reflects his reading style because the way he situates, he'll take a philosopher, and then he'll take all the philosophers around them, and then he'll take an event, and he'll say like, well, this is what this person says on this event, but then here's even what conservative people are saying on this event, and this person's more right than this person. This is very strange, right? So I think that like connection between philosophers and current events and newspapers is like a key aspect of his thought.
No, that's extremely Extremely correct. It's a certain materialist reading of an imminent conjuncture, which you already see in the first few pages of Western Marxism if you've opened it. Precisely, he's discussing Ernst Bloch's views on the First World War in relationship to the Chinese communists. And it's an interesting point of contrast, which I want to discuss with you all. Um, that I think is quite innovative and at the heart of what is most resonant. It should also be noted that Losurdo's most popular book in the United States, in the Anglo-speaking world, is, of course, his book on liberalism. And I know that there's folks on this call who have a love-hate relationship, we might say, with his book on liberalism. And that's actually one of the points that I wanted to raise with you all today, which is how might we understand Losurdo's critique of Western Marxism and Western Marxism's own theory of bourgeois culture? Because I think this is a key point that I don't see in this text of Western Marxism that I wanted to raise with you all. Because you see, there are internal dynamics in the Second International period that Losurdo is not paying attention to, which is fine. I mean, it's fine. We'll see the arc of his argument as it develops. But one of the things that we realize is that he comes out the gates of the text with this claim, really, that the blind spot of the Second International period, which created what he calls their social chauvinism, of course, which is not his concept, that had existed for quite a while, is born from the wages of imperialism. Now, Gabriel Rockhill will say on two different occasions in the introduction that this is also linked to labor aristocracy theory in the West. Yeah. And Rockhill makes an interesting point that labor aristocracy theory has its origins in Engels's book on the condition of the working class in England. And what I find interesting about Losurdo is that nowhere does Losurdo develop such a theory regarding Western Marxism. It is somewhat implied. It's not determined. You see my point? So that's maybe a merit of his approach, because I feel that if he were, because you see, part of the split that occurs within Marxism, he's pointing to as a schism and a split around the First World War, therefore around imperialism and anti-colonial struggle, and the sort of wide sea of two fundamentally different experiences. Experience of China and experience in Vietnam compared to Central Europe are almost night and day. But what we don't get an elaboration on is why Western Marxism initially breaks off. Because I would argue, if you read Herbert Marcuse's text called Soviet Marxism in the early 1950s, it's an interesting text to consider. Or consider the reviews amongst the Soviet philosophers in 1923 of Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, Deborin and Ruda. And you will see what their claims were, because there were two seminal texts that are known as the foundational, original texts of Western Marxism. Of course, this is Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy and Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, 1923. I think they're both published. Stalin, Trotsky, Lenin, and the vast majority of Soviet philosophers claim that these two texts are what? What do they claim that they are? They claim that they are philosophical refutations of ultra-leftism. Why? Well, the biggest problem with Lukács is Lukács abandons an objective account of the dialectics of nature. Why does Lukács do this? In his own defense, it has everything to do, actually, we go back now to the question of the working class in the Western context. And here, by the way, it must be said of Rosa Luxemburg's critique of Bolshevism, as Bolshevism, her general point being that in the context of Germany, for the German working class, Bolshevism does not have such an easy continuity or line of adoption, right? So what I find important to stress, therefore, are these internal rifts. And I think these internal rifts do have something to do with theorists who, yes, as Rockhill says, have a touch of petty bourgeois consciousness, because, of course, that's exactly what Lukács was accused of by the Soviet philosophers. And even, I shared an article today on the Discord, even Trotsky, because remember, at the time of 1923, what was Lenin's major text that came out just 1 year, 2 years before that? It was ultra-leftism and infantile disorder, right? So like it or not, Bloch, Benjamin, Lukács, Korsch are lumped into this category. Moreover, they have precedence with Pannekoek and council communism in the Netherlands. Because Pannekoek himself was, of course, Lenin was hugely critical of him, but what was his position, right? His position was that it was a question regarding the ripeness or lack of ripeness of revolution, right? And the fact that at a subjective level, the working class was not prepared for revolution in a proper way. I think that hits the heart of the pulsing heart of Western Marxism itself. You could say one of the pulsing hearts of Western Marxism is this turn to the subjective as a response to a perceived inadequacy of the primed agitation or possible revolutionary agitation of the working class. Yes, after 1917, yes, we witness what occurs here, okay? But there seems to be some dissymmetry. There seems to be some dissymmetry in other European locales. So these are some observations that I would like for folks to consider and provide feedback. Please, Deepika, is it? Please,
Yeah. Deepika. Yeah.
Deepika, please, welcome.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, to your discussion and also having read the introduction, and this is something that Rockhill and Lapons, the other author, right? They both talk about that the argument that is made is that, Marxism as a theory was developed in the West. So we talk about a whole bunch of, Marxist theorists and philosophers and all of that. But the first thing that does right away is it doesn't take into account all the Marxist theory that was being written in the non-West. You have Ho Chi Minh writing in Vietnam. So I'm talking about their writings, not about what they're doing. And then you have in India, I was looking at that name over there, Ram Manohar Lohia, who's a very well-known socialist writer. So there are these, people who are actually writing, and they don't make it into the pantheon. So that's the first thing, that's worth noting. But then the other thing is that I think it also develops maybe an unsaid split between the theorists of Marxism and where Marxism was actually applied. Because all the application has happened in the non-Western world, right? If you think about it, after the Russian Revolution. So you're looking at Vietnam, you're looking at China, and you're looking at a whole bunch of other countries, which defined themselves as socialist democratic. So there were elements of Marxism in what, these countries believed in, what these governments tried to do at the point of independence. So there's all of that, which really doesn't get accounted for, but that is the practice of Marxism, which is not taken seriously at all. But even as far as theorizing goes, I think what happens is that there are names beyond the ones that I've just mentioned to you, who were writing in the 30s and the 40s, in the 50s, but they're just not accounted for. So there is a way in which I think it stays very contained, within the West, and the conversation is going back and forth in the West.
Thank you
I'm
so
done.
much.
Thank you.
No, that's an excellent summary. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. This is the claim that's at work in the text.
Mm.
And then the question is, of course, how do we make an account for this, what you might call almost arbitrary, self-defeating division, right?
Mhm.
If this division is not reducible to a
Mhm.
question of academic recognition. It's not
Mhm.
like, oh, these Western people want to put themselves on top.
Mhm.
No, the division is
Mhm.
praxeological, right?
Mhm.
It has theoretical repercussions.
Mhm.
I mean, this whole business that he speaks of regarding um, the Chinese experience of emancipation
Mhm.
as perceiving whole categories
Mhm.
of Marxism, such as the national question,
Mhm.
in a fundamentally different way.
Mhm.
A text that really comes to mind, by the way, and then I'm going to move here, that if you haven't read, I want to throw out there for you,
Mhm.
called Gramsci's text. It's very short, called The Revolution Against Capital.
Oh,
It's
okay.
on 1917. You know the
Mhm.
basic argument.
No. Mm.
Bolshevism
Mm.
showed a model of revolution which
Mhm.
was anathema or 180, different than what Second International Marxists conceived of revolution and
Mm.
even what they interpreted from the mature so-called scientific Marx of capital.
Mhm.
Hmm? Not
Mhm.
merely the fact that it happened in a peripheral country.
Mhm.
Gramsci shows there's a whole other set of layers there, having everything also to do with the fact of will and philosophical problems, which is
Mhm.
exactly why Lenin dealt with the debate with Bogdanov and
Mhm.
why you get vitalism in the philosophical cauldron of Bolshevism. You see my point. So
Mhm.
anyway, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent there. Millie, please.
I hate to be too frank here, but what I am think is plainly missing from this conversation is how Rockhill and Ponce de Leon centered anti-imperial struggle as the cornerstone of authentic Marxism, and how like Western Marxism is like not the same in that way, and use Ho Chi Minh and like to talk about that, because as you know, he goes in to the next chapter to talk about Losurdo does about Ho Chi Minh at the Second International. Anyway, I'm done now.
Thank you so much. This will be obviously a big focus of ours. I think one of the questions I want this group to consider in a practical sense, in a very practical sense, is exactly how we can be better anti-imperialists.
Mhm.
If this diagnosis is so accurate, which I think it is, has a lot of truth to it, what is the practical import for struggle today? This is something we will get to. Matilda.
Um, to follow up on the last point, I feel like the two models that were being given, like from Losurdo's point, I got the sense that like the Western Marxists hadn't realized like the primary contradiction had moved to like the national question, and um and became more of like how Mao conceived of the primary contradiction, starting with Lenin's views like in the 1910s, and it seems like the Soviet view that was critical of Marxism, at least from the article you shared, was that their criticism of Western Marxism was that the being and the consciousness of the proletariat is rooted in activity, and that's what the Western Marxists missed. So I just wanted to pose those two separate models as different critiques.
Yeah, exactly. Matilda's pointing to an article which I want to recommend everybody read, which argues that Western Marxism is primarily born, right, from a philosophical debate over a move away from scientific socialism to what Korsch calls dialectical materialism in his book Marxism and Philosophy, 1923, which, again, as I mentioned, represents a philosophical response to a perceived deadlock in the activation of the proletariat, which is why also the critics of Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, on what basis do they criticize him? It's very ironic to us now. You know, they criticize him because he's too much basically of kind of like a voluntarist Nietzschean. Imagine that, calling Lukács like that. Imagine that. Because that's what he was trying to say in some sense, which is what's more important for revolution is the question of settling or discovering the problem of the consciousness of the proletariat as a priority. If you read the responses of the Soviet Marxists to History and Class Consciousness, you'll see that they reject this as petty bourgeois, they reject this as unscientific, and so on. So anyways, Justin, please.
Yeah, I wanted to also add that I thought the article that you shared on the genesis in the split of Western Marxism, I thought something that it added that I felt was really important to the Rockhill's introduction is I feel like he points out that in a lot of ways these very important figures to early so-called Western Marxism sees themselves as really developing and promoting Lenin against the dominant forms of Marxist orthodoxy within Europe, right? And they kind of they talk about how like Western Marxists overemphasize like consciousness, but like where did they get that, right? They see themselves as taking that from Lenin, as they see Lenin brought this important role of like the revolutionary like party of actively pushing forward for through practice compared to the mechanistic economistic forms of Marxism. So I think it's really interesting in a way that the split of Western Eastern Marxism is almost about what they really saw as the more significant contribution of Lenin, while simultaneously affirming in his like historical significant role in developing Marxism.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's also why Lukács's text, Lenin and the Unity of His Thought, will also come under profound scrutiny by De Boron and Ruda, his two primary critics. And of course, their criticism of History and Class Consciousness and the general reception of that text across the Soviet intelligentsia really, you know, led to, I think, sort of like a cycle of sort of censorship, which led to Lukács abandoning a lot of his core tenets in that text. We can talk about that at a later time. Spencer, please.
You know, Western Marxism is just not a category that is one of historical Marxism. It's, you know, apart from the New Left, and it's a late New Left notion. You know, it's 76. And it seems to me that there's, you know, a lot of revision going on. The earlier period, you know, would have had other divisions. And, you know, the most obvious would have been that between, you know, official communism and Trotskyism. And there's some conflation, right? That, okay, Perry Anderson is like a Trotskyist, And so there's some memory of an older division. But obviously, what he considers to be Western Marxism is not confined to Trotskyism or the left opposition. He includes all kinds of people in that framing. And it seems to me that in some ways, Rockhill has a different set of concerns than Losurdo does with respect to this. I mean, Rockhill to me seems much more focused on, the theory industry, the contemporary landscape of publishing, and maybe attacking people who are not active communists or socialists in academia, but sort of publish in left spaces and this sort of thing. His environment's much more the Western Academy, it seems to me, whereas Losurdo is much more embedded in the older debates of the new left and going back. That's one thing I'd want to put on the table. And I'm not really sure that I care. I guess I'll just say this. I'm not really sure that I care that much about people who claim to be leftists in the academy today. Like that's just, I'm much less concerned about what people do with Adorno or the Frankfurt School or French theory, the French fries, than I am those thinkers themselves, who are often much more interesting than their followers. And the other thing I would say is this issue of Lenin. And I think that, here I'm just going to say flat out, it's not just, it's not just Lenin, right? The idea that Lenin is somehow different from the Second International, I think is extremely dubious. He's a product of the Second International. He grew up, he learned his Marxism in the Second International. His teacher is Plekhanov. His history is rooted in the debates of the Second International. His mentor is Kautsky. His preoccupations with respect to Kautsky after the revolution are with respect to his renegacy, right? So the idea that the Second International is revisionist to core. And I think relatedly, the idea that the Second International is unconcerned about imperialism and colonialism, which is implied here, that it's not until Ho Chi Minh and the Chinese communists, and here I'll sort of refract Deepika's point. Even when they're talking about the non-West, right, it's a very selective account, right? The Chinese Communist Party and the Vietnamese Communist Party are not the only communist parties that are spawned in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution. And in fact, the glaring omission is India. And it's Emin Roy that's debating the national and colonial theses that are mentioned without mentioning that debate, as though it was just sort of sprung from the head of Lenin. And the issue there was, of course, Gandhian mass nationalism, which is very much comparable to the Kuomintang in China. But there were other delegates to the Second Congress of the Comintern from Indonesia, from the Middle East, from the Arab world, from Iran, etc. None of that gets mentioned, and it's maybe, those aren't the heroic parties. Those aren't the parties that conduct armed struggle. Those aren't the parties that win, right? But those are a part of the legacy of communism and arguably of the critique of so-called Eastern communism or official communism is the conduct of those parties. The subordination of communism to nationalism in India, for instance. That it's a prop for Nehruvian socialism and arguably betrays the project of revolution. There's just a lot that's missing from the account of the post Bolshevik non-Western revolution, but there are major debates in the Second International about imperialism. And imperialism is not the same thing as colonialism, right? That's another issue, right? It's about Bonapartism. Germany's an imperialist country before and after it has colonies, right? And the fact that France rules Algeria and Indonesia isn't what makes it imperialist. It's the fact that it's the legacy of Louis Bonaparte's regime that makes it imperialist. So those discussions of the Second International as somehow merely revisionist, Eurocentric, social chauvinist, I think are important. And I think, lastly, what really is meant by the labor aristocracy in Engels and in Lenin really needs to be addressed. It's, in contemporary anti-imperialism, there is the claim that the working class is bought off by the wages of imperialism, and that is never a Marxist view. That is not Engels's view, and that is not Lenin's view. It's an argument about the nature of the organizations of labor unions that are being bought off politically by non-proletarian parties. It's not that, there's some privilege of working class people in the West that's like money in their pocket or some nonsense. It's about the struggle of the working class for the control and leadership of their own political and social institutions. So the debate in the Second International is, and this is, I guess, a footnote, is it doesn't include people from the non-West. Why? Right? And I think this is, in a sense, related to my point about the Kuomintang and the Indian National Congress under Gandhi. Because there's no socialism outside of the West. Right? The issue of the issue that Perry Anderson broadly frames and I think distorts, and I think is then distorted by taking him as the object of critique, is that mass political parties for socialism in the core of capitalism existed at one point of time in history. And that's the Second International. In the Second International, there was a mass political party for socialism in every major Western country, arguably with the exception of Britain. Certainly, there was Marxism right here in the United States, where I am. There was Marxism in France, Germany, all across Europe, and it was a coordinated world party for revolution. That was its self-understanding. And Eugene Debs and Lenin and Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg and many, many others were comrades in that project. And so the question, to me, that has to be framed is the one of defeat. Right? Defeat in the core of capitalism. Right? Before we start talking about philosophy, right, we have to talk about the defeat of the revolution, and that's where not only the omission in Losurdo's account is India, the other omission is Germany. Right, the question of Western Marxism is the question first and foremost of the defeat of the revolution in Germany and by extension of Europe, the homeland of the Industrial Revolution, and thus of socialism, of proletarian socialism. And so if we're talking about Marxism, I mean, it seems to me we have to be addressing the issue of world proletarian revolution and the defeat of that project in the core of capital can't be, addressed at a merely philosophical level. but is one that the philosophers and the thinkers are responding to.
Yeah.
Throwing a lot out there, but
No, it's good. No, it's really good. Thank you. And
trying to
Spencer's written
back the frame up a bit.
No, I appreciate that. Spencer wrote a really great series of books on the concept of Bonapartism, which, as he intimated, is dialectically a part of imperialism. And so one of the things I benefited from Spencer's intervention.
I can't hear you, Daniel.
Am I muted? Can you hear me? You can hear me? Oh, yeah. One of the things I like about Spencer's intervention about imperialism is that he clarifies what imperialism is in the time of Marx. In such a way that it has a relationship to a certain form of state bourgeois leadership under what Marx would call Bonapartism in the 18th Brumaire essay. So anyways, those are very helpful. Let's keep it going. Aaliyah, please jump in.
Someone in the chat said, we're all preaching to the choir here. So I'll preface this by saying I'm probably going to be preaching to the choir too, but for the sake of this being on YouTube, I kind of wanted to just pull out in a sort of very Losurdoian fashion the kind of like really practical and obvious advice that's here and like needs to be followed and that we need to actually like say out loud, which is that, regardless of whatever theories about how these elements, so in this Perry Anderson section is so interesting because in calling this book kind of like the repository for all these themes that Losurdo is railing against, the idealism, the primacy of theory, this Eurocentric social chauvinism, Lenin kind of identifying a material basis for that. And, we can see as that develops it being, kind of an organic, response to the results of class struggle that goes on, this withdrawal into academia and all this stuff. However you feel like, that came about or whatever, what we see also here is that what the ruling class, just globally, like the global, like imperial apparatus that stretches over the planet is able to do is taken the most successful elements of this Western Marxism, the ones that are so appealing and are so successful in diverting true revolutionary energy, and then taking those and actively then expanding those mechanisms and using those as counter-revolution. And the main things that we see are, one, a sort of an ahistoricity as a kind of positioning, or this idea that everyone has to be this super specialist in what's like around them and very relevant to them personally, in that they can identify with it, and that's you go as deep into that as you can, but we're not going to bother studying history. There's that kind of like sick roast about how Foucault has the most to say about why we should reject the whole history of socialism, but just is basically totally illiterate in revolutionary history. And I think that, like me in public school, no, I did not learn a single thing that was meaningful to me about the world. And I think my whole generation finds ourselves totally re-educating ourselves. So we see this like a historical education of like the whole world history is one of our greatest tools. And we see that now. We see like these cities that are passing ceasefire resolutions like in the middle of the country, like that never ever would have happened. Like, and I'm not saying that the US left has been successful in sort of I don't know, actually putting a stop to what's happening in Palestine, but we are seeing things that wouldn't be happening unless there was this huge explosion of information sharing and the sharing of this whole century of revolutionary and imperialist history in Palestine. But at the same time, we're already running up into running up into a wall of how far that can go, because I mean, beyond the obvious, like no one's sitting around reading all day every day, like the right, like fascist forces, they already know that, they're already worried about it, and they are like hard at work pumping tons and tons and tons of money into counter information. What is the other thing? The rejection of the seizure of the state and the usage of the state and the rejection of the party form wholly. So what's our practical advice here? What do we have to learn? We need a party. That's all I have to say on that one. But thanks.
Thank you so much, Aaliyah. That's amazing. Very spirited, very much needed intervention there. Yeah, I mean, I think one of these points that I said in the beginning, I don't know much about Losurdo's teachers. Perhaps somebody that does, I invite you to weigh in on that. But one of his clear points of influence is no doubt Lukács. And one of the things that Lukács does, building off of Lenin's theory of imperialism, is to make a systematic study about the Western intelligentsia in the as conditioned by imperialism. Because Lukács in The Destruction of Reason has incredible things to say regarding this precise point. And I noticed that continuously in Western Marxism, we see a similar operation at work. I want to invite, I think it's Ivan and Anita to jump in.
Hello.
Hi.
Just Ivan, I mean, Anita's here, but I'm gonna have something to say. Good evening, comrades. I'm very excited about this thing. And I'm really enjoying the discussion so far. I couldn't agree more with Ali about how we need the party and how I would love to read more journalistic interventions by Losurdo, assuming that he's not just a Western Marxist who writes, big books of philosophy and not actually engage much. Which brings me to this kind of point of contradiction that I find that we find ourselves in, which is that we are all basically Western Marxists. And as defined, by Losurdo and Rockhill, and this includes Rockhill and Losurdo. It's basically that's who we are. So that's something we need to deal with, and that's something that we need to not be if we're serious. Myself included. I mean, I know that many Marxists, especially of the persuasion, such as Losurdo's and Rockhill's, don't have jobs in academia, but still I wouldn't be here. I don't, but I wouldn't be here if we didn't spend a really long time in doing postgraduate work and so on. Anyway, what some other thoughts that I have here is somebody made a point about how I mean, I just said it. The kind of in the West, I mean, this seems to be the general kind of line here. The Western Marxism is academic and non-political, whereas Eastern Marxism is political and non-academic, kind of. To be maybe to exaggerate a bit. But I would like to point out that I think that it's not so much, even if we go back to the Second International, it's not so much that the Western Marxism isn't political, it's that it's social democratic in a disgusting sense, like Democratic Party of the United States. Angela Davis says go vote for, for the Democratic Party. The Communist Party of the United States says go vote for the Democratic Party. I'm a member of the Communist Party of Canada. We're not saying vote for NDP, but we may as well be saying vote for NDP because that seems to be the line here. So, I don't know if we want to kind of abandon that whole political field of I guess now I would say Western Marxists and let them off the hook. They're not political. They're very political. And I think the reason that they are very political, i.e. social democratic political, they run for office, then, they're in power, etc., is because they're a lot worse than labor aristocracy. They're, petty bourgeois professional class that makes a lot of money. And these guys literally bought off. Like academics in the West are making 200 plus grand a year. Anybody that's been around for longer than 10 years or anyway, they're bought off. They have nothing to do with the struggle. They're just way far too removed. And then my one other point, I mean, again, I'm like, these are just provisional points. I'm just have some thoughts, right? This whole business about this kind of hard distinction that, you know, about imperialism and about colonialism being a crucial factor, right? Which Losurdo seems to be kind of saying. Sure. Yes, in a sense that yes, it was China, it was Vietnam, etc. But it was also Europe, right? It was also Eastern Europe. And it's not that simple. It wasn't just imperialism. Nationalism did get involved and so on. And I don't know if we're going to hear anything about Yugoslavia from Losurdo, and if we do, and why or why not. But you know, I'm from Yugoslavia, and you know, we had a real revolution over there, and it was implicated with all kinds of, you know, nationalism and some form of colonialism, you could say. That'd be hard to kind of, but we're definitely not, you know, people of color, or slavery doesn't have much to do with it, and the classic kind of imperialism is not necessarily what happened over there, and it's not an anomaly, I would say, so much. And Greece was really close, and Italy was really close. And so there continues to be in Western Europe. Anyway, my point is Europe is a little bit different from United States. So, you know, France and States are not the same. The States, America, United States, Canada literally have no left, no communist parties, nothing, right? Zero. Whereas, you know, France did, and Italy did, and Greece did, and Germany did, that was mentioned a bunch of times already, almost, you know, had a revolution there, and Hungary, etc. So anyway, just a few things to throw out for us to discuss. But I'd like to know where other, if people don't mind introducing themselves and so on. Just, you know, I wonder if there's actually people who don't have an academic background in this room, if they would want to speak out, or if they would even want to be known as such.
Me.
Cool. Awesome.
Probably others here. Who else?
I'm sure there's others, yeah. I would recommend folks introduce themselves in the chat. We have a large quorum, and I want to hear from folks. Ivan, thank you for those reflections. I think you've challenged us to, you know, walk away from this study group at some point, trying to understand why why we are all inevitably thrown as Western Marxists. Sounds almost Heideggerian or something. It's kind of terrifying, actually, if that label haunts us. Why does it haunt us? Because you could also see a sort of reverse idealism, right? Which is that, well, there's a sort of voluntarism of the intellectual, right? That communism is not possible in the West, and it's the intellectual's fault, as opposed to the material conditions and things of this. So that's something I really want to continue to discuss. Stephen, please jump in.
Okay. Regarding this particularity, whatever, between Europe or whatever, I think we can even go further than that and say it's a problem within the Anglosphere, particularly. You know, like Karl Kotsky, I think, has something about why the British hate theory or something like that. And I can't remember the work, but it's like, he's basically just like, yeah, I don't know why there are no parties in Britain that ever take off. So, and Spencer honestly said everything I wanted to say. Like, yes, I don't really think Lenin breaks with the Second International that much. Basically, Muggs line on that. So that's all I got to say.
Thank you very much. Chris, welcome.
Thank you. And though it's nice to be among people that think in a similar way, I also don't want to preach to the choir or just be preached to. So I wanted to address two points where I didn't see the mention of these arguments made by Western Marxists. And I wanted to see if you could with your more intensive information about them, tell me whether this is the case. So one question is, they talk about Lukasz's disdain for the party form and for collaborating with the state. But to what extent could this have been a response to seeing the SDP, which featured members of the Second International, vote for war credits and support German imperialism? And the other question I had is, in a certain way, doesn't it make sense that Western Marxists like Pollock would criticize the state capitalism of the USSR? Because, I mean, the stated aim was to overcome a system based on generalized commodity production, and they found themselves competing with the West trying to produce commodities. And it just seemed to me like those Western Marxists, they were justly noting that there was no off-ramp. And because there was no off-ramp, you could go straight into something like Khrushchev said, where he was saying, oh, the important stuff has already been achieved, and let's just be commodity producers. So could you respond to those?
No, I think you make a great point. I mean, I think history and class consciousness as an intervention is coming at, Lukács famously says in his early 1960s reflection on the essay that he was conceiving of the Communist Party from the perspective of an outlaw Communist Party at the time. So this is related to the accusations that he received that the text is ultra-leftist. In some ways, that has been the source of what has been most celebrated in the West regarding that text, precisely because as Stalinism shuts down the dictatorship of the proletariat and enters into, they declare the victory of that stage, because they have, after all, a stagist conception of revolution, for which there's a sense in which they are victorious. That has an impact on thought, that has an impact on intellectuals, censorship, purges, and so on. In hindsight, you can see the strength of Lukács's text will emerge there, right? As a counterpoint to what will become Stalinism, right? In hindsight. So that's the basis, I think, of some of those critiques. On your second point, and others can jump in and build on more on that. On your second point, yeah, I mean, Losurdo makes an interesting point, which is that after 1917, he seems to suggest that Vietnam and China have an immediate awareness of the sacrifices that had to be made, including the development of the NEP, precisely as a war economy measure for surviving what imperialism and its encroachment was doing to the Russian people. Whereas then he counterposes that to Ernst Bloch, who is concerned with a utopian conception and is highly critical of those compromises that Stalin eventually will embrace and so on, right? So that, I will admit, Chris, that leaves me wanting a little bit more. It precisely because the question mark there is not resolvable just by a theory of petty bourgeois ideology.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just resolvable by that, right? That would be, I think, too easy. So, I mean, I do agree, therefore, with Spencer's point that the complexity of the division internal to the communist revolution in Germany is one place of further study and interrogation that really will help us contextualize these interventions of the birth of Western Marxism.
The reason I ask is because having read Destruction of Reason and his later work, he seemed to me as someone who didn't end up rejecting Eastern Marxism or involvement with the party or state. And I think I just wanted to know why someone is condemned for something that he wrote in the early 20s when he so full-throatedly repudiated it in his later work.
Well, you would have to bring the specific critics to bear. Which
Yeah.
critics are you referring to, and at what time, at what point in time? I think would
Well,
be the question.
the
Because
the
it's criticized from all sorts of positions and angles and perspectives. Yeah.
the essay from the author that you sent to us today,
Yeah.
what's her name?
Yeah, it's an
V.
excellent piece.
Uh,
Her name is, see if I can pull it up real quick.
um, Asaduleva.
Yes.
Right. So, it's pulling out all these people that called him a subjective idealist that just focused on consciousness. And
Right.
then he goes on to write these massive works about how these different bourgeois intellectuals were the products of their condition and how they faced a moment where they had to choose between reason and the defense of their class position and the world that uh, put them on high. And that is why they receded into irrationalism. So I guess why would this scholar focus so much on a text that is idealistic in some ways, but that was then kind of dialectically
Because of
later?
its influence, because of its
Okay.
influence, because without history and class consciousness, it becomes a Bible that is sort of subsequently criticized, rebuked, renounced by Adorno in the Frankfurt School. It
Mhm.
becomes the origin for so much of Walter Benjamin's reflections on Marxism. Korsch says after Marxism and philosophy that Lukács and I are in fundamental philosophical agreement.
Uh-huh.
It's the initial coda of Western Marxism. That's why. Lukács, in his response to De Born and Ruda, the critics, he says, "Look, this was meant to be a discussion starter, right,
Uh-huh.
amongst communist philosophers. You're taking me too literally, so to speak." But it was sort of like that, that's why it was just so catalytic for the discourse.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Matthew Strauss, please. You are on mute. There you go.
Hi.
Hey,
How you doing?
good to see you.
Okay. Good to, good to see you too. So I wanted to bring up a couple of points and I'm probably not going to do this. I um one one issue that comes to my mind in this discussion is how people look at class and how people conceive of class philosophically. And it it always sticks in the back of my mind that there are different interpretations of class within the context of Marx's Capital. And um, on one side of the spectrum, you have the volunteerist who thinks that if I join up, my individual contribution is going to make the difference, right? And if a bunch of us do, then it'll all equal uh, an awakening. And on the other side, you have the sort of passive school that says that if I just wait for the revolution is inevitable and it will come, and all we have to do is wait for it. And I think what this does, if I can put it in uh, Hegelian terms, is that it it sort of holds separate. How do I put this? Sort of an abstract universal point of view, sort of the passive that will happen because, the revolution as being, something along those lines. And on the other side is the individual or the very, very particularist. And the real way to look at class that Marx highlighted in Capital is not easy to is not easy to think about in philosophic terms, probably because most of us aren't trained uh, to look at it that way. But over and above this sort of debate between Western Marxism and Marxism proper and what Stalinism put out, deeper than that is how you conceive of class. The capitalist class is fully conscious. Okay, so it knows what it's about, and every capitalist is a representative of his class. This is something that Marx says in Capital, and at the same time, the entire capitalist class is structured to reinforce that structure. Then we look at the working class. The working class is not yet conscious, and on top of that, if I can put it in Hegelian terms again, if the capitalist class is in and for itself, in other words, it's fully conscious, you could say that the working class at this point is in itself, but for an other. In other words, it's a tool of the capitalist class to reproduce the capitalist mode of production. So in this situation, neither an individual voluntarist viewpoint nor a passive, it will just happen, we just have to wait for it, will do. So what is the right way to look at it, right? And I think this is the question. I'm not going to answer it here because I don't even know precisely how I would resolve that, other than to say that that sort of underlying philosophical question underlies these different questions that either Western Marxism brings up or Losurdo brings up, the question of the second international versus the third, and so on. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you so much, Daniel.
No, thank you, Matthew. It's really good. There's also the question of the maturity and sophistication of the class of the peasantry in China and the activation of the peasantry, which is a qualitative difference to contexts of attempting to organize a revolutionary agitation for the working class in Central Europe. The other thing I posed, which I invite us to think about, is Losurdo's theory of bourgeois ideology. We remember Rockhill begins his introduction, and this is important to keep in mind, with a theory of ideology from Engels. I would highly recommend as secondary literature to this entire course, Theories of Ideology by Jan Rehmann, which is actually a very helpful book about repositioning Engels's theory of ideology. We know this as ideology as false consciousness, which after French theory and post-structuralism is seen as vulgar, of course. To insist on that would be perceived as vulgar, and especially even after Frankfurt School and so on, academic Marxism and so on teaches us that. So I would invite us to consider the merits of an Engelsian theory of ideology. And at some point, I'd like to actually give a brief presentation about what that precisely is, how we understand that, especially with Engels's, with certain categories, such as the superstructure, Engels's theory of power, Engels's theory of the state, things of that nature would be useful to tease out in future sessions. Let's go to Evie, please.
it's Evie. My phone just stopped. But what I wanted to respond to was a while back now, like regarding like what sort of practical, what's what's the practical advice that we can pull from what's useful about describing Western versus Eastern Marxism or imperial Marxism, versus anti-imperialist Marxism. And I like earlier, yes, obviously, the party form and, the development of class consciousness through that and like the necessity of that mechanism, but also there's something historical about the rejection of and the opposition to actually existing socialist countries.
Yeah.
That is to me like the biggest dividing line, and you see it a lot. Like the city that I live in, there's a bunch of young Maoists who are just like super anti-China and anti-Russia, and they sort of take imperialist positions on geopolitics, right? And so that it is tied to their philosophical understandings and to their like philosophical approaches to history, right? And so when they pull from Lenin, they totally ignore the colonial question and the self-determination and national liberation aspect of anti-imperialism, and they go for the straight like economic analysis and go, well, China is exporting capital, and so that means they're imperialists now, right? So they're not looking at imperialism as historically contingent and like colonial in nature.
Kicked out of a fucking excuse my French. I got kicked out of a red study group, a Marxist study group, because of my position on China, and had to write a polemic using Roland Bower's work, Rockhill's work, and Carlos Martinez's work to try and show why these Western Marxists are opposing actually existing socialism. I mean, it's comical and it's ironic to me that we are not looking at the concept of Western Marxism right now as a dialectic between actually existing colonized people and their authenticity in organic grassroots movements versus like the academic proto-bourgeois intelligentsia in MP. All right, sorry, I was better. I'm going to stop talking now.
No, it's all good. Thank you, Millie. Yeah, I think this is interesting though, because there is a subtlety that I want to invite folks to consider when we think about the category of social chauvinism that we saw as present in the Second International. Well, it seems to me that Losurdo and Rockhill make a fine point regarding the defeatism and the pessimism of refusing to see contemporary efforts of socialism, to reject them outright, tout court, that itself is a compromise, is itself an expression of an ultra-leftism that is ultimately harmful to Marxist practice. At the same time, to overly indulge and celebrate existing national socialisms seems to me to reproduce the same social chauvinism that Losurdo is criticizing in the Second International itself. Do you see my point? Does that make sense? So there's a fine line there, not falling into a kind of Dungism that would be proto-nationalist or something like that.
Anyway. Well, and I think just as
Yeah.
a super quick, because I think
Please.
that was just maybe just a little vague, is I think we really want to look at, are people making criticisms of the systems of democracy and actual like proletarian participation in governance? Are people making, you know, economic criticisms of the industrial sector, like all that stuff, you know, criticisms of, yeah, maybe like how much sort of capitalist stratum is allowed to exist in their powers? Or are we, you know, and so there's that, and that's important stuff to do, and that could maybe fall under the umbrella of Western Marxism, right? But then under the umbrella of like, especially, and I hesitate to even call this like Eastern Marxism, but I think when, you know, we see these kind of reactionary bubblings up of this sort of Eastern Marxism for America, which we all know is kind of
Exactly.
so trending.
Right.
It's a lot of fetishization of kind of the most reactionary aspects of culture, even if they're fringe in the areas where they are culturally, like historically, traditionally relevant. It's very much, yeah, like a co-optation of the worst aspects. And in that sense is like, there's, I don't know if I could call it racism per se, but it's a real opportunism. It's a real exploitation that has like a very real racist character, because it is intended to play on the existing, like, kind of racist bigotries, reactionary sentiments of the disenfranchised working class here in America, as opposed to like a more universal class consciousness that has an international character.
Yeah, very well
Sorry
said.
to butt in. But.
No, that was excellent. You said it better than I could. And you did an excellent job. Yeah, you can import Eastern Marxism to produce a kind of narrow social chauvinism. And we see that, I think, on the left today. Akshay, please.
Yeah, sorry, I raised my hand so long ago, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess like I found myself really intrigued by Spencer's comments, and I was thinking about like what sort of is the specificity of imperialism in that second international moment, and what is it for us today? And I guess in that older formulation, it's sort of finance capital, so it is sort of a particular kind of fusion, like of the state operating as a custodian of kind of monopoly interests for the nation. I mean, obviously, we're in a very different moment than that, you know, it's a century later, many things have changed. So it's sort of also like, so what is imperialism in this particular sort of moment? And I mean, again, like if the older split was sort of Stalinism versus Trotskyism, which I guess is socialism in one country and the Eastern Bloc, as opposed to the project of sort of like permanent revolution and the idea of this, you know, we'll sort of export the revolution to Germany and Greece and Italy, or and I don't know. I mean, in the sense that like a lot of the, you know, both with in the US, like I guess, you know, the claims of a lot of Trotskyist groups being sort of semi-funded by the CIA, and on the other hand, the kind of like you know, I mean, in India, for example, Stalinism also has quite a, I mean, like the contemporary split in the Indian left would be sort of the electoral CPI Marxists who are sort of pro-China and who disavow entirely kind of the Naxalite movement and sort of the CPI ML liberation. So, I mean, there's a kind of, again, like interesting split between this kind of like urban-centered party that says, oh, we represent the proletariat and we want to sort of side with the respectable Chinese state, as opposed to kind of, you know, the peasant rebellion in the Indian countryside. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm not so sure. Like, you know what I mean? I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't really know what exactly Losurdo's imperialism is specifically, but I was hoping maybe you could sort of tease that out a bit more.
Yeah, we need to flag that as a task for future sessions to do that. I need to read more in it. I did just finish reading his book on Bonapartism, and I want to make a few comments on that in future sessions as well. Matilda.
Question. Still thinking kind of about how like the kind of Maoist primary contradiction has like displaced the Engelsian one of like Engels with like the mode of exchange has to become like adequate to like the socialized mode of production, and like that is like what the Western Marxists are guilty for, is like wanting to end money. basically, because it's not adequate to the socialized forms of production. And it's like putting that on the horizon, like, and displacing it with the Maoist primary contradiction. But what I wanted to comment was on, in the introduction, there's Engels' letter to Mering that's cited on ideology, and it's excellent. Like, there's like 3 Engels letters on ideology that I'll post in the Discord that I'm like, I love reading. They're very dense and like very thoughtful. But I feel like Rockhill was quoting it at like cross purposes with this point. Because he's quoting it here to like substantiate like this like objective critique of intellectuals and like grounding the socioeconomic conditions of intellectual ideas. But like why Engels is making this letter and this intervention is to critique simple cause and effect applications of Marxism to intellectual ideas. If you read the letter to Mering, Mering has just written a book called Lessing Legend, and it's basically a critique of cultural production. And he's saying that like, yeah, like, you know, he ends the letter saying like, basically like, maybe not a necessary condition for like liberation, but like what you've done is a great lever, like a great force of like dissolving these mythologies around Lessing, who was a philosopher and playwright during the reign of Frederick the Great, and saying like this cultural intervention you made was extremely significant and it was a great lever. And yeah, it just, you know, I felt like it was at cross purposes to his point. And I just suggest everybody to read those letters.
Thank you very much. This is going so nicely. I just want to do a time check. Since we're going to meet every week, I want to keep our meetings to like an hour and a half out of respect for time. 2 hours can be a lot in this day and age. So what we'll do is we'll just go through the rest of the hands up. Feel free to raise your hand if you want to make a comment, and then we'll close. Because again, we're going to meet every week. We're going to focus on 30, 40 pages. We've already flagged some questions. I invite everybody to the Discord. Could somebody please put the link to the Discord invite in the chat for folks that don't have it, by the way? Thank you.
It's also already up there too.
It's already in there?
Mm.
Oh, thanks. Spencer Leonard, please jump in.
Hi. Yeah, a couple of things. One is what I view as the anti-internationalism of the whole notion of Western versus Eastern Marxism. To me, one would have to make a real argument as to why the categories of revisionism and orthodoxy are to be superseded, displaced. After all, Mao's own criticism of the Soviet Union is framed in those terms, his criticism of Khrushchev. It's not criticism of the West or the Soviet Union as Western, it's criticism of revisionism. It's an old vocabulary that goes back to the Second International. And I think that, in other words, I guess I'm an old, I like the older languages. I think not talking about Maoism. I mean, Maoism is the elephant in the room here, right? And Rockhill is a pro-Chinese Maoist today. He's in favor of the state the state regime in China. Is that a Marxist position? I mean, I guess that's the position of, his party, the party of, socialism and liberation. But, there are reasons why people condemn Deng Xiaoping and the capitalist roaders in the 1970s. I'm not a Maoist myself, but those are sophisticated debates. And of course, what Akshay was raising about, the split within international Maoism as expressed in for instance, India, but expressed everywhere, right? The split between, people's war line, cultural revolutionary Maoists and, what won out, which is, preserved in the distinction between the Naxalites and the CPIM in India. But you can see it in France, you can see it in Germany, you can see it in the United States, right? The Weather Underground were people's warline Maoists, right? The American New Left is Maoist, overwhelmingly by the 1970s. Almost everybody who was prominent in the Students for Democratic Society is a Maoist in the 1970s.
So are the French theory people.
And the French theory people, right? I mean, Maoism is very arguably a product of Germany, France, and the United States as much as it is of Chinese intellectuals. Charles Bettelheim certainly made the argument for the so-called capitalist restoration in the Soviet Union more thoroughly than any Chinese theorist did, and as the Chinese themselves acknowledge. So I guess I'm interested in that older language, and I want to go back to a couple of things, and I'll just this is what I'll conclude with, and that is, I am I'm as acute, I'm not making anything remotely like $200,000. I don't know who does, right? But I'm an academic. I've got a PhD. I'm an intellectual. I am, and I don't see any reason to apologize for that. I think that this is a discussion for intellectuals, and I think we're engaged in a kind of bizarre sadomasochism if we deny that. And the issue is the intellectual impasse, right? There are other impasses. There is a political impasse. We can say, well, party, we need a party. Every country in this, including America, is full of parties. They sell their newspapers, go down to the rally, go down to the demonstration. You'll find them there. You can join them, right? The problem is, what are you joining? Right? You're joining a sect. You're going to join something that can't create, that's not going to lead to a mass political party for socialism, which is what we want, right? To think through that impasse, right? How do we get from tens and hundreds, from, reading groups and sects to hundreds of thousands and millions, right? That can fundamentally challenge capitalist politics in the United States and around the world. That is a problem that has an intellectual dimension, for sure, right? There is, you can talk to the working class. The working class has intellectual, notions as well, right? You can talk to them just about forming a union, and they'll say, well, didn't we try that? Didn't that lead to the gulag? It's not like they would enter into that in just some simple notion, some unmediated notion of their immediate interests. No, they know that there are wider historical horizons that are opened up by any activity on their own part, right? They know that without having read a book. It's in the material world, this history of our defeat. And so I think that we, should address it that way, right? I mean, or I guess I would say this, I'm hostile to the invocation of anti-intellectualism by Rockhill, right? The idea that if you're not practically engaged in, I guess, like his particular sect, and its political activities, that somehow you're decadent, and that your criticisms of the left must be motivated by pro-imperialism, right? Which is the deep problem I have with his work, right? That the idea that Horkheimer's criticisms of Marxism around the world are motivated by the CIA is sketchy, intellectually dishonest, quite frankly. Can't begin to explain how Adorno and Horkheimer taught a generation of towering German Marxist intellectuals that we all know and learn from, right? These are problems that I think that it's bad argument. It's ad hominem. It's weak, and it gets to the question of why does Lukács write about philosophy? Why does Korsch write about philosophy? Why aren't they writing works like Lenin and Luxemburg and whoever else you want to claim to be an orthodox Marxist in the Second International? Why aren't they writing party literature? Or what does it mean to write philosophy as party literature, if it is party literature, right? That's not the normal thing to address. It's not what you're getting in What Is to Be Done or imperialism or left-wing communism and infantile disorder or whatever. And I think that, Lukács and Korsch are raising the question of philosophy in 1923-24 because they're saying, what Marxism is about is it's about, the history of philosophy. It's about the history of religion. It's the Torah and all the prophets. It's Plato and Aristotle. It's Locke, Rousseau, and Hegel. The entire inheritance of the struggle for freedom is what's at stake. We can't lose sight of that. That's at the heart of what looks like a set of immediate tactical and strategic debates. And in fact, Lenin understands that, right? Lenin understands that this is about putting an end to the prehistory of man. This is about opening up entire new horizons of human freedom. And I don't think they're wrong for doing that, but it becomes a terrible legacy because intellectuals who were witnessing the crisis of Marxism as they were the first to do so. And they, in a sense, were sort of, planting that flag and saying, okay, here's the high watermark after the Bolshevik Revolution. Like we're rethinking this whole question of Hegel, Marx, history, the stakes of philosophy as the stakes of the proletarian movement for socialism, right? That the proletariat is the inheritor of the entire struggle for human freedom, and in that sense, the meaning of philosophy itself. That, I think, is taken up by later intellectuals, and it becomes all that we have, right? It becomes what Adorno's talking about. It becomes what Horkheimer's talking about. And I don't think that, they are trying to be the preservation of that moment, of that high point of consciousness of the struggle for freedom in and through the struggle for proletarian socialism in the absence of that practical struggle. And I think that, the question to me about the limitations of some thinkers rather than others are they trying to make an apology for the death of Marxism? Are they trying to set up another project in the place of the death of proletarian socialism? Or are they trying to say that's not what we wanted to begin with? Or are they holding on to that problem intellectually of what would it even mean to try to be Lenin now as an intellectual? Because that's what he was. He wasn't an activist. He was an intellectual, right? Lenin didn't go to the demonstrations, right? That's not his point. He's an intellectual. He's writing. And so I think that, that crisis of intellectualism is what I see being dismissed with this category of Western Marxism, which I don't think is a problem unique to intellectuals in the West. So that'll be my polemical intervention there, Daniel.
All right. No, I appreciate it, Spencer. I mean, I do find merits in the concept of the compatible left. I don't think the CIA appendage is even necessary to drive home that point. That's a bigger debate we can have in the future.
Sure.
That's a bigger debate we can have in the future. I agree with you that the fact that Adorno published journals that were funded by the Congress of Cultural Freedom does not convincingly taint the direction of his thought per se. I think that's a weak argument. But like you've opened up a lot for us. Where one question though is I don't see an explicit claim. Are you suggesting that it is implied though that the distinction between revisionism and orthodoxy is out the window and then replaced with this new what replaces it in this framework in your view?
I think that Eastern Marxism is being cast as revolutionary Marxism and Western Marxism is being cast as compatibilist and revisionist in that sense. And I think that that's dubious in the extreme. And I think it leaves open the question of, I think it leaves open wider questions of, what is the way forward for socialism in the core capitalism?
Okay.
And what is the role for intellectuals there?
Yeah. No, you've raised some good questions. Okay. Is it Yara or Yara? Pardon me, I don't know how to pronounce it.
It's okay. The Y is like a J, so Gyra.
Gyro, welcome, and please jump in.
Thank you. So I think a lot of what kept coming up for me as I was reading the intro was Ludovico Silva's Marx's literary style. And I think it kind of complements a lot of some of what you had said earlier, or even some of what you had just said very recently about writing ideology. And I think that's that's this thing that I feel like is kind of hanging over this discussion, the idea of like, there was the literary analysis that we can draw from, obviously this is a philosophical space primarily, but bringing in another discipline, the reason why I kept thinking about it was because I kept arriving at the same place around this fundamental wedge of ultimately, we are speaking different languages and these different interpretations have arisen over and over and over again. And within the academy, as I don't remember who said it, but somebody was talking about, the way that these things get litigated is often around the idea that we're attempting to draw new interpretations or we're attempting to situate Marxism a certain way. Or, I mean, even just when that resurgence happened around Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism and the way that the academy drove that conversation forward, but there was never conversation about stylistically what was being said, and even how just every bit of the study of that text through a literary analysis informs the kind of ideology that is being taught to the masses. And I think we should be honest with ourselves, even on the left, in admitting that a lot of people aren't primed to be political educators and aren't primed to necessarily don't engage in rigorous deep study before they start organizing people. And it's not about, creating some kind of litmus test or saying that necessarily needs to be the barrier to entry. But I think I've seen a lot of very well-intentioned people with a great deal of passion and concern really kind of throw to the wayside the idea that this is still a text that has many different living dimensions. And Silva is a poet and a philosopher. And so you can kind of get that as he's writing about this, because it is very poetic. It is very much a very romantic tone around it. And there's a really good review, or there's a review that I really liked, at least in the London Review of Books by Terry Englestorm, I think, Be Like a Silkworm, that goes into that, where you can read a little bit of his review of Silva's book. But yeah, I mean, yes. But yeah, I just think that that is really the fundamental thing we're talking about here, that there's within every language is a literal entire universe and so many different forms of interpretation. As many people know, translation theory is like very much still this weird kind of illegitimate stepchild of literary analysis, but and arguably philosophy. But in a lot of ways, that's what you're doing when you're sitting with a text outside of its original context. You are having to think critically about it. And I think we just often discount the extent to which we inherited a text that was just fundamentally, as you said earlier, written in a very specific time, in a very specific context. And there is this seeming like, because of the kind of, even that language we inherited around it being scientific, there's really this strong aversion to the idea that we need to give some licensing to how this style, what is the style and what is the style conveying, and how do we, what is alive and what isn't alive, and what is being transmitted in real time and what is still, it stuck, or I shouldn't say stuck, but placed where it is. And I think that question I find a lot in this conversation is kind of the subtext around the Western Marxism debate of just like, what are we even actually talking about here?
Yeah.
And these the real tension around not wanting to clarify ideology because no one wants to be authoritarian, and that allergy to precision can often lead to what I feel is some kind of like lazy or sloppiness around how we're actually conveying these ideas in different organizing capacities.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very true. In a certain sense, I think it would be useful for us to try to read Losurdo as carefully as we can there's a lot of things that aren't clear to me yet. For example, when later Losurdo will critique Hartenegri, Slavoj Žižek, Alain Badiou, he does so with a particular broad brush. Is that brush one that is putting forward a kind of dualism, as Spencer is suggesting, between a kind of righteous Eastern versus a bought out or compromised Western Marxism? I don't think so. I think we need to read him a little more carefully in this regard. And also, as a side point, just as a recommendation, once we do get into the contemporary, by the way, there are a few authors I do want to recommend that folks read as sort of like companions to Losurdo. One of them is Isabel Garo, who I think has, in her new book called Communism and Strategy, it came out this year with Verso. It's had a few reviews. It isn't talked about too much, but gosh, it's doing a very similar operation about trying to restore a political Marx, right? Because so much of Western Marxism actually, when we see this in Badiou's Can Politics Be Thought, written in the early 90s, it's basically a claim that historically Marxism as an ism is done, right? So we need to have a grand return to Marx. I mean, this is the same thing that Derrida does with Spectres of Marx, right? So that's a lot of what's happening in Western Marxism, is a very grandiose claim that Marxism as a living tradition is dead. What I fear, and I don't know if this is true or not, is that Losurdo may be saying the same thing. Because I too want to say that the Second International is not something that should be thrown out entirely. So, okay, let's go to Colin, and then we'll go to Spencer. I don't know if anyone else has a hand up, and then we'll close. Colin, please.
So first of all, I want to say that, I respect there are a lot of different tendencies here, and I think that's a good thing because we can all learn from each other and see our different perspectives and how they come together. And we're going to disagree about some things, including a very contentious issue, which is the status of China and whether China is a socialist state or a capitalist state. However, I think it's important to bring up that Losurdo's view, Losurdo is a supporter of Deng Xiaoping and the reform and opening up. And he has a very, I think, well-written and I personally believe convincing defense of Deng's reforms and opening up, which is, I'll post the link here. It's on Red Sales. And I think it's worth reading, even if regardless of your opinion, because it's going to, I think, inform parts of this book. I think parts of what his criticism, one of his criticisms of Western Marxism is going to be that Western Marxism has a prejudice towards markets and economy and finance and things like this, because it primarily conceives from the standpoint of the imperial core that's dominating through these mechanisms. Whereas from the Eastern Marxist perspective, there's actually an attempt to create one's own, like to kind of have that economic base built up independently. And I think this is important reading because it's context for what Losurdo's ultimate position is that I think is informing this. I also wanted to say something about a form of Marxism that occurred in the West that is fundamentally part of the anti-colonial tradition, and I think is really important, and that is groups like the Black Panther Party, who were committed to anti-imperialist Marxism, and that's a tradition that I think that we should be, if we're going to be looking at what Western Marxism should be reborn as, we should probably look towards traditions like that, which were influenced by Maoism, were influenced by third world struggles. Regarding the role of the CIA, which is of course a contentious issue, and I don't think we should use this to dismiss people by any means. Like, I think it's really important to read people who received money from nefarious sources. But I want to say that it is, as far as the Frankfurt School goes, it was an open secret that I mean, it wasn't ever a secret. Like, Angela Davis wasn't, like, the CPA USA didn't want her bringing Marcuse around because they knew that he was worked for the State Department and that he had these ties. It's you just look at open up like a Hegel journal, and they'll introduce Marcuse and they'll say, but don't worry, he's not one of the bad communists because he actually works for the State Department, right? And so there is like a kind of, like, this is kind of open and well known, and I think, maybe a lot of these people just took the money because they wanted money. I know people personally, like professors who had admitted to me, they were like, like, this is what I was doing back then, right? And I don't want to I think the point of the analysis that Rocco offers, this isn't to say that like the CIA is like pulling the strings on these people, but the CIA has picked certain people to give funding to, and not just the CIA, but the different foundations, and they're not going to support past a certain line. You're not going to receive funding going past a certain line. And if you want to receive funding, you have to give the capitalist system what it wants. What it wants is not a defense of their enemies, right? Like of the states that they're opposed to. So yes, I'm gonna end with that.
Thank you, Colin. No, that's very helpful. Let's continue to track this. I got an interview coming out with John Bellamy Foster, the editor of Monthly Review, on Lukács, and he gets into Baron and Sweezy's letters where they talk about Adorno's communism, and I can send a link to those. They're published on the Monthly Review, and they reveal an interesting perspective, critical perspective on Adorno's politics. This is a very Losurdo line, is to sort of, I mean, I feel that Losurdo has that materialist question when it comes to any great thinker. He first wants to start with what's their relationship to the paper, to the daily news, to the events of their time. Anyways, in this exchange of the Monthly Review founders, they discuss in a very critical way Adorno's politics, and they reveal its the hollow basis of it. It's worth looking at. Magnus, please.
Yeah, hey, can everyone hear me okay? I just wanted to make a quick comment on the whole like Horkheimer discourse, or like Adorno and all this stuff, like how what was just brought up by Colin there is like this, okay, yeah, they got their money from here and there, and I don't think we should really focus on the money issue as much as we should, from a hindsight, we see, okay, we now know that they got their money from here and there, and this is kind of what Chomsky would call like self-censorship or whatever, in the sense of like, okay, they were saying what they were saying, not actually from an ideological standpoint, which I think is in many ways the ground of this Western Marxism, is that we see a lot of these people being guided to saying what they say because that's what pays the bill in many ways. And yeah, I think that's just it, like really understanding Western Marxism within this scope of this, all the voices, whenever Bloch or Marcuse or whatever stepped a little bit out of line, trying to push the borders of what were they able to say, what were they able to push. They managed to get some stuff out there, but in the grander scope, that was constantly pushed down. And then this other whatever deconstruction, then the French, in many ways anti-Marxists, which I think is my favorite part of Rockhill's work, is really his criticism of a lot of the French school, a lot of what was promoted. And now I just also recently saw your interview with Emmerich Melville there about Cliscat, which I read his book last year there when it came out, and it was such an eye-opener to really get vocalized these kind of things of that everything is possible, but nothing. No, everything is allowed, but nothing is possible. These types of groundbreaking statements that I think really breaks with a lot of the tradition of Western Marxism. But yeah, that was just my ending remarks here.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we'll close with a final comment. Sorry for keeping you all late. Again, I want to stick to an hour and a half moving forward, just because, again, just out of respect for time. And we're going to meet every week. We will record everything. So if you can't come, it's not the end of the world. I'll send out the recording the day after. Let's hear from Spencer, and then we'll break for now.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of historical amnesia here. The Frankfurt School had never worked for the CIA, never took a dime from the CIA. Frankfurt School worked for the OSS, which actually shows their orthodox Stalinism. It shows their orthodox communism. Loads of American communists worked for the State Department. They were following the People's War line that was the international communist line, right? Just as Indian communists were told to join the British Imperial Army to fight the Japanese, right? They were told to support the imperial state in British India. Right? That is the line internationally. Every allied country should be supported militarily, right? And the OSS was a military arm of the US government in the Second World War. There's nothing unusual about this. This is why there was a drive to purge the State Department of communists in the 1950s, because they were there as a legacy of World War II and the New Deal support and the communist support for the New Deal. So this is just bizarre, historical revisionism. To me, and obviously Losurdo would have agreed, right? I mean, the Italian Communist Party followed the same line. His party followed the same line. So I'm not quite sure what we're talking about sometimes with respect to these matters. Where you publish an article, I mean, that's like saying they publish with a capitalist publisher or something. By the way, the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union took direct material aid from the US government via the CIA and via the precursor of the CIA, the OSS, during World War II, right? So just all of that needs to be clarified, right? The United States is bankrolling the entire effort of World War II militarily. You have to be a Trotskyist to actually think that World War II is an imperialist war that maybe you shouldn't serve in and go to jail for, right? As someone like James Cannon did. So in that sense, we have to be clear. The argument that has to be raised, right, that I'm trying to raise is whether official communism is orthodox Marxism. We can't really understand Marcuse or Adorno or even debates in France between Merleau-Ponty and the Socialism Barbarism group and Sartre and others around Le Temps Moderne, unless we don't understand that the dissident Marxism is from the left, or at least attempting to be. Certainly Trotskyism would understand itself as a leftist critique of a revisionism that is destroying the revolution, right? That's the real argument, right? That's the argument about, and whether people are dealing with that at a philosophical level that's very rarefied or not, we can't parody these things, right? We have to understand people's own intentions.
All right, very good. This has been a nice session. I like the way this started out. A good group we have here. Healthy debates. Everyone's not yelling at each other, being patient with each other. That's what I asked for privately to many of you, knowing that many of you have criticisms of Losurdo's method and approach, but happy to have a venue where we can exchange both combination of these kind of intellectual critical analyses, but also sort of more passionate reflections as well. So join the Discord, reach out if you got any questions. We'll meet again on Tuesday at 7:30. I'll try to send out an email with would it be helpful if I said pages to read to specify? All right. Yeah, I'll do that.
Thanks, Daniel.
All right. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Nice
everybody.
to meet everybody.
Thank you.
Good session.
Yeah. Bye.
Goodbye.